Guys, watching rivalry weekend this weekend and then looking forward to conference championship weekend next weekend, I had one really, really sad thought. And that is the magnitude of these 2 weeks and what they mean for the college football playoffs and for the rest of the season will never be replicated again in the history of the sport. And what I mean by that, if you think about it, we're going towards the 12-team playoff. Look at Ohio State, Michigan, for example. I came on here last week and we talked about how that game is a de facto elimination game. And so is three of the conference championship games this weekend. Well, Louisville's not now that they got beat by Kentucky, but it was looking like it could have been. And in next year going forward, that Ohio State Michigan game doesn't have the same impact. Like, sure, it stinks you lost to Michigan, Ohio State. Guess what? You're still one of the 12 best teams in the country. The loss means relatively nothing in terms of keeping you from achieving your ultimate goal, and you can still play for a national title. And stuff like that's going to be, or let's look at the Iron Bowl. Alabama's big win over Auburn. The reason that game was so impactful is you lose that, it's done. Your outside hopes of getting to the national title over. Next year, with the same field, you could drop that game to Auburn, turn around and beat Georgia the next week, who doesn't need to win the SEC title to get in, and make the playoff because it would be an auto bid for the SEC champion. So you would still have a path to the champ or to the playoffs. That's what I mean by going forward. The magnitude of these games. Louisville's another example. The magnitude of their loss to Kentucky. If they next year, it don't matter. They can still play Florida State this weekend, beat them, and get an auto bid as the ACC champion. So maybe conference championship week won't be hurt quite as much because of the auto bids, but rivalry weekend will be crushed. And I think, and I'll end with this, we might want to look into. I don't say do it the first year of the 12-team playoff, but if we do see rivalry weekend getting hurt, it might be a decent idea to move rivalry weekend from the end of the year to the middle of the year when everyone's still got stuff to play for.
That's
That's
not a terrible idea. Freddie, go ahead.
yeah, I was just gonna say I haven't heard anybody really talking about the rivalry, like changing rivalry weekend. I mean, if you look at Texas and Oklahoma, that's not played at the end of the year. Like that's played in the middle of the season. Well, probably third or fourth week of the year, and that's still a great game. I mean, that's one of the earliest rivalry games that we have, and it's great. Um, I agree with you that they may not mean as much. I mean, you could take this year as one of the best examples of how it won't mean as much because Oregon and Washington, it doesn't matter, right? Either one of those teams are going to get in. Alabama and Georgia, either one of those teams would get in, hypothetically, in a 12-team playoff, assuming that if Alabama lost and kept it close, they wouldn't drop below the 12 line, right? So I hear what you're saying, and I agree with it, but I don't know necessarily. Nothing will change that. I mean, because the automatic conference bids, I think is needed. Because if you look at this year in particular, there could be a one-loss conference champion be left out, or even a undefeated conference champion left out in the case of Florida State. Not saying it'll happen, but there's a slim chance that would happen, and that would never be the case. Started with the 12-team playoff. And Chase, I want you to go ahead and go on this topic, and I want to bring something else up regarding the 12-team playoff that's very interesting that I noticed. So Chase, go ahead.
Yeah, don't get me started on the 12-team playoff. You guys know how I feel about that. But just Quinn, you make a great point, but I'm going to call out some scores here from this past weekend. Almost every big rivalry game that had implications were less than 10 points scored. Georgia Tech 31-23, Ohio State Michigan 30-24, Washington State 24-21, Florida State Florida 24-15, Alabama Auburn of course 27-24. Like that right there is just an amazing rivalry weekend. I didn't even think about next year going to a 12-team playoff and how much that actually might lose meaning in the rivalry weekend. So that makes a lot of sense, Quinn. And I've got to say that's the absolute – I mean, it's the perfect emphasis of why you may not want to move to a 12-team playoff, because you lose a little bit in some of these big games like this, and that's kind of what something I've just games in general. I didn't even really think rivalry weekend, but you lose some of the magic that goes into these games because Alabama loses that game. Maybe they're still sticking around the 12th seed or something like that. And definitely if they beat Georgia, they're still in that top 12 to make the playoffs, right? Florida State, somebody like that. And it's just not as magical, right? The 4th and 31 that Alabama came across, Florida State that had to get past without Jordan Travis. It loses a little bit once you move to the 12-team playoffs. So Quinn, that's absolutely an amazing take. That's I think is going to be imperative to next year's regular season. Quinn, you had something?
Yeah, I wanted to see what y'all think about the idea of maybe moving rivalry to the middle of the year, where a loss to your big rival could affect your momentum in the middle of the season and maybe cause you some losses down the stretch that you maybe not would have had otherwise.
I'm gonna go ahead and take this one. I think that's not a bad idea. I think in the SEC, definitely, and this is a scheduling thing with Oklahoma and Texas coming about. I think we actually will see some of those rivalry games in the middle of the season. Like Auburn, I think Auburn might still be then for Alabama, but some of those other games might be in the midst of the season for some of these SEC teams. So you won't have that last weekend winner take all kind of deal for some of these games. I'm actually for that. I think it's better because you're looking at it like, okay, this is still an important game. Because sometimes when you look at these games, Georgia Tech's like, 6-6, right? Barely going bowling. Okay, this game doesn't matter as much. But Georgia Tech, that's 3-2, that's 3-1, something like that, looks a lot better for Georgia at that time. So I actually kind of like that idea, Freddie.
I just I don't know if it would make that big of a difference personally, because rivalry week to me, I'm not necessarily watching rivalry week for chaos when it comes to the top teams. I mean, that is a byproduct of it, but I'm just watching great teams who hate playing each other. So that being at the end of the year is great to me. It's a great way to kind of just cap off the entire season watching, I hate to say it, but, fights, just like the Missouri game, like that was an entertaining game to watch. Even though it was a blowout, those two teams hate playing each other, so it was a very fun game to watch. So, even the Iowa game last week, like it was a brutal 13-10.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed watching it because those two teams don't like playing each other. So I think if your perspective on it shifts from I want to see complete chaos and see teams get bumped out of playoff contention in rivalry week, which we didn't see this year, to I want to see great football between teams that hate each other, I think that the quality will still be there. Now, championship Saturday or weekend is a different story. And I want to bring this up because this is something that has something to do with the conference championships. You look at last week's college football playoff rankings, and you go to the 12-team playoff, Ole Miss is ranked 12th. But they would not be in because Tulane was the highest group of 5 team, which, oh, by the way, Ole Miss already beat this year on the field, but because of the automatic buy-ins, Ole Miss would not make the playoffs and Tulane would. So that's a different conversation for a different day, but the conference championships not meaning something in the group of 5 space completely means everything. But for the other Power 5 teams, not completely sold that it does.
I'll say this, it matters in one way, and I'll end on this. Going into next year, everyone we're looking at has a path to the playoff from winning their conference, barring 3 teams: Iowa, Oklahoma State, and Louisville. However, in the 12-team playoff world, Oklahoma State, Iowa, and Louisville are 1 win away from playoff spot.
It's true. Iowa in the playoffs would just be brutal.
So, yeah, probably would have an MVP of a punter for the first time ever if Iowa won a game. But I mean, so when you're looking at it now, I guess the question comes to, I'm not going to take away from what Quinn is saying, but leaving it at this is the buy-in spots are probably not great for playoffs.
See, I think they are, and I think they're needed. And this is a whole different conversation. I'm sure we will get in on the off season, but I think they're needed.
Oh yeah.
Especially this year, I think they're needed.